All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we talk about Latter-day Saint pride, Charlie Bird, and confusion. Before we get into this, I want to remind you that we have the Liberty and Doctrine of Christ tour going on this October. If you look at two major themes in the Book of Mormon, it is all about liberty and all about the doctrine of Christ. And so you can see how these things are brought together by Mormon and the prophets in the Book of Mormon, and how they work in tandem. In fact, they must work in tandem. That is the ideal situation. And so we look at the founding of the church, the restoration, and a number of different sites there in the Northeast and the Midwest, and then we go to also the founding of America and a number of sites for the founding of America on this tour. We talk about why the Constitution and the founding of America is so important for the church and for the doctrine of Christ, and how they work in tandem. So take a look at that at the website at cwicmedia.com, cwicmedia.com. There is limited space for that. It is this October 2023, and we'd love to see you there. All right, delving into this topic is a difficult topic to talk about. Most people won't talk about this, not publicly, but we've really got to bring this front and center, because what is happening now, not only in the culture in the U.S. and in the West, but in the church. I'll show some examples of what the apostles, the prophet, have said about this. But we're becoming very much a teddy bear Jesus culture in many ways, which is basically saying, for example, in the LGBTQ community, we love you as you are. And of course, we do love you, right? That is definitely the case, but there's never any qualifiers to behavior and commandments or anything else. And it's very difficult to follow this and to see where this is leading in a Pride Month, where much of the rainbow and the advocacy for a different way of life, and I've said this many times on the podcast, that identitarianism is a direct assault on the traditional family. It always has been. It always will be. That's what its end goal is. There's a difference between loving an individual who has same-sex attraction or has gender dysphoria, whatever it might be, loving them as a child of God first, but also standing for truth and proclaiming truth, and talking about the law of chastity and the commandments of God and understanding these things. And this is not what we're seeing happening in this trend within the church. And it's a little bit concerning. In the culture more broadly, this is a good example of what is going on. You can see the last White House Easter, the last White House Veterans Day, the last White House Christmas, and then during Pride Month here with the White House. And of course, you see nothing going on for Easter, Veterans Day, or for Christmas. But for Pride Month, there is a pride flag, right? It is becoming the new religion of the country. And these are religions, they are secular religions. You've got faith versus secularism. And Pride Month, the advocacy for that, again, is not just loving individuals, regardless of what they're going through or what their tendencies are or what their orientation is, because that's necessary because we're all children of God. But it is an advocacy for a different way of life and for secular ideas that primarily come out of academia, the religion of academia. We'll have some prophets and apostles here that are going to bring that up to some degree. But this culture that is shifting so at breakneck speed is also shifting in the church at breakneck speed. It's a little bit behind, but it is also infiltrating the church. And these are two different gospels. These are two different religions, and they do not work with each other. One is represented by the banner of the Christ and the doctrine of Christ, and one is represented by a pride flag, and by many other things, a fist in the air. They are diametrically opposed. It is faith versus secularism. And these ideas that have come out of academia are secular ideas in many cases by those that are very much themselves diametrically opposed to faith and religion and the traditional family. and yet they get brought into the institutions, first with academia, then through media, then through our public schools and all of education, and then through our corporations now. We see this everywhere. We get it now in our religion. Also, it's starting to happen in a number of different denominations. It's not starting to happen. It's happening quickly in a number of different denominations in Christianity throughout the United States. It's happening at a legal level, right? These are all institutions that Antonio Gramsci said, these pillars that must be taken over by these ideas, right? Gramsci is an Italian Marxist who believed that we had to move toward a cultural revolution and not just the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, not just the economic classes, but we had to enter into all these institutions to change the culture with these Marxian tenets. And yes, identitarianism and the pride flag and LGBTQ intersectionality advocacy is rooted in these exact same ideas. The DNA is exactly the same. And you can follow this. I've done this on a number of different broadcasts here, a number of different episodes, and you can see the DNA build up to where we are today. The predecessor to intersectionality and identitarianism is critical race theory. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined critical race theory just a year or two later, a couple years later, coined intersectionality. What we are living through today is intersectionality, different identities. It's the same exact thing as critical race theory, built on critical theory, the primary tenet of the religion of academia, but applied to a number of different individuals and classes and sexual orientation and gender and a number of different things. And this religion is entering into the church as well, into our culture. And the prophets and apostles have talked distantly about this at kind of a higher level, maybe we can call it a parable level, about these things in general conference, but they get much more specific in other venues. We're going to cover a few of these, but you can see here the CTR rainbow. This is something that a lot of people already in the church would already love to have. Oh, I want a CTR rainbow. You're conflating two different religions. You're conflating faith with secularism, faith and ideas that from the restoration and principles of the gospel with secular ideas. It doesn't work. I now get accounts all the time in the last few years of individuals that from the pulpit or from the young women's class or Relief Society or Elders Quorum or primary, where the teachers are talking about Pride Week or Pride Month and doing things that really are very inappropriate in the chapel. They're wearing pride pins. A lot of accounts of people wearing pride pins this month, and beyond that, pride ties. And you're bringing secularism, secularist ideas into the gospel and into the church. Here's a recent board that was up in the hall of a chapel that many of you may have seen already, listening to their voices, which should be listened to, of course. But what you have here is basically a pride board in the hall of the church with a chain here that is made out of pride colors. And you can see here in the left side, if you're looking on video, this is a pride tent, maybe a tabernacle, right, of pride colors. And this is not something that's just on the fringes. This is happening all over the place now in the church. And the question is why? And I want to give some suggestions here as to why this might be. We're going to see that there is a thought process in the church, and what I mean by that, in the culture of the church, that says we need to love everyone, absolutely, right? But at the same time, there are no qualifiers to truth, order, and behavior. You never hear this. And there's this idea of a hope in change of doctrine in the church, replacing hope in Christ. I'll get into that a little bit more here as well. Another thing that needs to be stated is talking about the proclamation on the family and where this is, how this is being framed in a lot of people's minds and on social media within the church oftentimes these days. It's seen as a bully, right? To use the family proclamation, it's like you're bullying something. No, it's not. There's you may have seen on social media, there's a couple that put up a big banner this month of the family proclamation. Why would they do that? Well, the reason they're doing it is because nobody puts any qualifiers up. There's this pride flag, which is an advocacy for a different way of life. And yes, ultimately, it is an attack on the traditional family. And so putting up the family proclamation is simply a defense. It is a defense of the traditional family. And they're getting attacked from left and right, saying that they are haters and homophobic and everything else. That's not correct. They are standing up for truth. They are proclaiming truth in an environment that is completely against the traditional family. And so part of what is happening here with silencing people is they're saying you can't use the family proclamation. Don't talk about the family proclamation. People are now scared at times to bring it up in sacrament meeting in a talk or in a lesson. Or how about very, very popular come follow me influencers that when the lesson comes up for family proclamation during the year of Doctrine and Covenants, toward the end of that year, there was a lesson on the family proclamation. They don't even bring it up. And I don't know if it's because they don't believe in it. It wouldn't surprise me. But they won't even talk about it. They did something on this is the place, the monument of Brigham Young coming into the Salt Lake Valley instead of talking about the family proclamation. It's being silenced because people are saying it's bullying because it's hateful. It's hateful now then to proclaim the truth and to support the traditional family, to support the order of God. That's where we're heading. And again, it's not a slow process anymore. This is not drip, 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 drip. This is a fire hose that is coming into the culture of the West and into the church. You can see this even with the influencers around. I've talked about one of them already, but you can look at Charlie Bird. Okay, Charlie Bird is a gay Latter-day Saint. He's been a covenant-keeping Latter-day Saint according to what he says, and he's been held up with books in Deseret Book, not a surprise, as an example of a covenant-keeping Latter-day Saint. Ben Shalati is another one, right? Look, I'm all for supporting covenant-keeping gay Latter-day Saints. I've tried to do that quite a bit on this podcast because they don't have very big voices out there. So whenever I get a chance, I do that. These are gay individuals or those that have same-sex attraction that are living according to the gospel and keeping their covenants in the church, keeping their covenants with God. But there's something interesting that's happening here where there is a strong move with these individuals to move toward this idea of a teddy bear Jesus and a teddy bear gospel. It is love and support, great, need to do that. Love and support everyone as a child of God, but don't talk about commandments. Don't talk about the law of chastity. And in fact, it goes beyond that. You can see with individuals like Charlie Bird and Ben Shalati that where they're and I bring them up because they have very high profiles. And they're both very similar on how they've treated their covenant keeping and being a gay Latter-day Saint. And that is that they believe in up until recently with Charlie Bird, they believe in keeping the commandments. They want to be members of the church, but they're very public about being gay, having same-sex attraction. But there's this little window at the end of all of this where there is a belief that the family proclamation is being used to bully individuals. And number two, that that the interpretation of that family proclamation is not about just a man and a woman marrying each other. Right. And then what that leads to is, again, this idea of a strong spiritual and emotional investment in the idea of a hope in change for doctrine, basically gay marriage in the temple. instead of placing the hope in Christ. Imagine what that really does. So it says to these individuals and to many others that follow this and support this idea that the church is going to change their doctrine on eternal families and their ordinances in the temple because they're going to go along with the culture. And so their hope is in that change instead of saying, I have a cross to bear and I need to put my hope in Christ and follow the law of chastity. And so that idea on the family proclamation and that hope in change instead of a hope in Christ is opening the door to a massive amount of confusion because these individuals are brought up in stake firesides nationwide in the U.S. and in Canada, multi-stake firesides. You've got bishops and stake presidents that are putting them up on a large platform within the church without putting on any qualifiers about what it means to be gay, about the church preaching against a gay lifestyle, and about the law of chastity. None of that comes up in these. I've seen several of them online. It doesn't come up from the individuals that are giving the talks and from the leaders. The qualifiers, none of it's there. And it leads to this mass amount of confusion. And so they go around, these influencers, they'll go around and they'll speak in these firesides. And of course, a lot of them are to the youth. And they start following them on social media. And what do they say on social media? Well, we believe there's going to be a change, essentially. We believe this is our interpretation of the family proclamation. And the reason Charlie Bird is mentioned in the title is because he just got engaged to his boyfriend. So he's had a lifestyle where he has had a boyfriend for the last few years. How confusing is that to the kids, to the youth, when you put them up on a fireside and you don't explain these things? I mean, the truth is the firesides are pretty good. You know, Ben does a great job on these firesides. I've seen them, except for that last little window that is left open. And so it could be spiritual, and the youth and others start following on social media. With Charlie, they follow him where he's got a boyfriend the last few years, and now he's getting engaged, he's getting married, and he's kind of saying, look, this is the avenue that I'm going to take. Now here, for example, earlier this year, Charlie Bird gives his interpretation of the family proclamation, right? And listen to what he says, because this is becoming a very trendy way to think about the proclamation and about marriage in the temple. Listen to what he has to say here.
Part 2 of answering how I reconcile the family proclamation as a gay Latter-day Saint. It helps me to remember that while the family proclamation does affirm the importance of marriage between a man and a woman, it actually doesn't say anything about gay individuals,
okay,
gay marriage, or gay relationships.
Okay, so again here, so what he's trying to say is, well, it says that it's between a man and a woman, but it doesn't say it's not between gay members of the church, right? That they maybe will eventually, there will be more revelation that will be given so that there can be gay marriage in the church. That's this hope in change that I'm talking about. Keep listening.
So I think this document becomes most problematic when it's viewed as something it's not, or when it's used as a weapon.
Okay, so there we go with what I was talking about previously, right? It viewed as something that it's not. So he's saying what it's not is it's not talking about the traditional family. That's his interpretation of it. And it's an idea that's the problem here, is that idea that it's not about a man and a woman, and that it's not about the traditional family, that it's actually open to everything. We just haven't had the full revelation for this. And if we use it so that it is about the traditional family and just about a man and a woman, then we're using it as a weapon. See, so what he's trying to say here, based on what we've just gone over, is he's saying, take away the first commandment. Take away the first commandment. Take away the commandments, period. Take away the law of chastity. Change the ordinance in the temple. And if you stand up for truth, as President Nelson says, even when it's not popular or politically popular, that's what he says, even when it's not politically popular, right? What Charlie here is saying is that if you're going to do that, then you are using this as a weapon, or as many have said, you're using it as a bully club. And that's wrong. That is really wrong. You need to use this because it is truth, but at the same time, love the individual. You can do both, as President Oak said. Keep listening.
I don't believe its purpose is to give people the grounds to criticize gay families, divorced families,
I don't know anybody who does
mothers,
this.
single parents, or couples whose relationship structure doesn't follow typical gender roles. It's not spiritual ammunition, and honestly, I hate when I see it used to patronize or judge.
Okay. If it's used to patronize or judge, then I agree with him. But if it's used to stand up for the truth, I completely disagree with him.
You know, there's this great line towards the end that says different circumstances may necessitate individual adaptation to the counsel it provides.
Okay, so he's going to go toward that revelation side. We're looking for more revelation.
And I'm grateful to belong to a church that promotes personal revelation. I believe in an ongoing restoration, and I don't think God's done teaching us about the importance of families. I don't have all the answers, but I do know my divine worth as a child of God.
Okay, so absolutely it is. Right? Of course, his divine worth is as a child of God. That's the number one identity given in President Nelson's identity hierarchy. So absolutely, and we need to treat Charlie this way, and Ben, and any other gay Latter-day Saint. Whether they're, by the way, whether they're following the law of chastity or not, we need to treat everyone with love, and we need to treat everyone as a child of God. That is crucial, very important. And if we move outside of that, then that's where these pernicious ideologies enter in and take a stronger hold, because you're leaving a massive void that the Savior would not approve of. So we love these individuals. We put our arms around these individuals. We welcome these individuals. But we don't have to agree with them, and we don't have to give up on the First Commandment. But you can see where this goes, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm a covenant keeper, which he's starting to change now, his own words. And he's hoping, he's going along the lines based on his words. And I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth here. Charlie, if I am, let me know. But he's moving forward in a direction where he thinks that the church is going to end up going anyway. And it's just a timing issue for him. If he was only born 20 or 30 years later, now I'm putting words in his mouth. But you get the idea, right? Is that, then the church will have changed and they'll allow gay marriage in the temple and the law of chastity will no longer apply. And, that's the idea. And that's what these Latter-day Saint influencers are pushing and advocating as well. And that's why they don't want to bring up the proclamation on the family. That's why they don't want to bring up the law of chastity. And therefore, many members are confused. So with Ben as an example, he's got a video in Deseret Book in their new section, their video instruction section called Cwic. And in the video, for example, he's speaking to another young Latter-day Saint here, to another Latter-day Saint. He's a gay Latter-day Saint. And the message eventually is basically, this Latter-day Saint is gay and he's going to start dating other men. And there is nothing in here that is going to be brought up about the law of chastity, about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. It's all just the teddy bear Jesus side. And look, there needs to be some of that teddy bear Jesus side as far as making sure we love everyone, right? Everyone is a child of God. So there is no going after them and condemning them and et cetera. But you need to stand up for the truth, and that none of that ever exists. That's why there's so much confusion. And quite frankly, we don't get it a lot from the pulpit anywhere, right? It's almost like the church, all of us, are put into the spiral of silence on this. We need to have that dual message of love. President Oakes will go over this, of love for each child of God, regardless of what they choose to do in their lifestyle, right? It's separating the sinner from the sin and proclaiming truth and following order. Because otherwise we have our kids here that are going to be so confused. They all many of them end up being advocates for this type of thing. And now, Charlie Bird goes out and gets engaged And he's doing this publicly, right? His message is very public, which is why I bring him up. This is nothing condemning Charlie or going after Charlie or Ben or anybody else, right? I don't think that changes or shouldn't change how we love them. It shouldn't change how, we would put our arms around them and let them know that they're loved, that they are children of God. But it's a public message. And Charlie's being very public about all of this. So his opinions are very public. He's got a very large following, and he's putting out his engagement to his boyfriend publicly on social media for all these followers to view. And of course, a lot of them are very excited about it because there's a mass amount of confusion on this. And it's not surprising to me that there is a lot of confusion on this. And going outside of those two and others that would be influencers, because there are a number of influencers that support these two individuals in their message without talking about the law of chastity or putting any kind of proclamation of truth along with it, along with a teddy bear Jesus message, a teddy bear gospel message, which is, to me, worse than anything that Ben or Charlie are doing. These are people that know better or should know better, or maybe some of them just actually have the agenda of that hope in change other than a hope in Christ. Now, recently, President Oaks and Sister Oaks gave a fireside for the youth, and it's called Stand for Truth. And this is very interesting about what he's talking about. He's talking about getting ready to get married. He's talking about why it's important to get married younger and what some of the obstacles are to that today and why it's being more difficult for marriage to be pushed off. But what he's talking about is primarily the idea of family. And here's what happens. He says, I just received a valuable letter from a 16-year-old girl who lives in a state where we have few members. I will call her Amy. Her letter is important because she expresses feelings that are common in young people all across the church. Listen to what she says. I feel like I sometimes get inconsistent and confusing messages from the church. Now, I am going to give you just my opinion here, but this is not just in your local ward or in your stake. I think this is all the way through, and this is one of the problems. There is not a lot of direct messaging. She's confused, and a lot of members are confused about where the church stands on certain things because there's such a large amount of information on and just being bombarded with the message of pride and a lot of other pernicious ideologies that there isn't a stronger direct message coming directly from the church on this. So it's going to be confusing. But here's what she says, and this is a perfect example of where a large portion of the church, I believe, of the membership of the church stands in the U.S. In my day-to-day life, I see members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on social media act as if they aren't part of this gospel. She's exactly right? She's exactly right on this. I feel like I am the only young woman in my ward who sees the things I see wrong with the world. I truly don't understand why so many youth, and this is not just youth, in our church don't see any problem with people changing their gender every other day, dating people who are of the same sex or identify as no gender. Okay, well, that is happening everywhere. And the way you know that is everyone listening to this episode, watching this episode, knows it's happened in their own families. It's happened in their own wards. It's happened in their own neighborhood. They know this is happening very, very fast. It is everywhere. She continues and says, at ward or stake youth activities, I am asked my pronouns, or at school, I am asked to dance with a girl who thinks she is a boy. I know we are supposed to love everyone and show them respect, and I always do. I just feel that there is a line being crossed. There is. The line being crossed is not checked. That's the problem. That's the confusion. Where is the check on the line being crossed? I wish we heard more talk from church leaders about this problem. Now, this is going to be very interesting, the way President Oaks treats this. He says, why does her letter strike me so profoundly? She wants to do what is right, right? These are not haters, but they believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why does her letter strike me so profoundly? She wants to do what is right, but she feels surrounded by values and behaviors she feels to be wrong, and she just doesn't know what to do about it. Remember that a lot of what she brought up here are from fellow members of the church and church leaders. She wants to stand for truth. That's the name of this broadcast here that the church did, that President Oaks and Sister Oaks did. She wants to stand for truth, but doesn't know how to do it with love. In a devotional to young adults at Ensign College, Elder Clark G. Gilbert and I, we're going to cover this a little bit, described this challenge of standing fast with love while proclaiming the truth. See, there's the check. There's the check. He's telling us what to do there. I wish we had this more, for example, in General Conference, right? The proclaiming of the truth there is oftentimes in these other talks is what I've found, that are given at BYU addresses or youth or YSA firesides. And so you have to kind of look around for it a little bit. He says we can still love others and find common ground without compromising the truths we know. And we are compromising this. You see this left and right because there are never any checks given when we talk about these things, or when the LDS, the Latter-day Saint influencers, are bringing these topics up. It's all about tolerance and kind of a malevolent compassion that exists. The malevolency of that exists in that compassion because there's no truth and order being given along with it. Now, this is what President Oaks says. The confusion of these individuals with their gender, for example, gender dysphoria, can assume different forms at different times in a person's life. Affected persons and family members should therefore take the long view. It's not just about affirming everything right now. That's what this ideology asks for. You be you. I live my own truth. It pushes away in a very postmodern way any kind of an objective truth or standard. Take the long view and seek to rely and to act on eternal principles. That's where real compassion, that's where real love exists. I have pondered this subject for some time, he says. Now, in the love I feel for those concerned with such subjects, the Spirit has impressed me to use this opportunity to emphasize precious truths the gospel of Jesus Christ reveals to help with such confusions. Now, this is what he brings up, and this is what is not happening. Young men and women, your church and seminary and institute leaders and teachers and your parents have the responsibility and the inspiration to teach you the truths of the restored gospel. It's not just affirmation. And then he goes to these two areas here, and this is pretty interesting because on this podcast, we've magnified this quite a bit, these two areas of focus. We've picked up on this, and we can see that one of the areas is the two commandments that the brethren have really focused on, and that is love God first and then love your neighbor as yourself, right? And there is a priority in that. These are two commandments with different priorities. So first, the priority is to love God, and that is the truth. You follow the truth. The second is to love your neighbor. Well, what we're doing here with this teddy bear Jesus approach is we're only following number two, love your neighbor, which really, without the first one, again, is just a teddy bear Jesus approach. It is a malevolent compassion that does not take into account, as President Oaks said, those eternal principles. And then he quotes Elder Christofferson, who has also talked a lot about this at BYU addresses. He says that, Elder Christofferson says, putting the first commandment first, loving God first, does not diminish or limit our ability to keep the second commandment. So why are we skipping the first commandment? He says, to the contrary, it amplifies and strengthens it. Our love of God elevates our ability to love others more fully and perfectly because we, in essence, partner with God in the care of his children and because we're inserting eternal principles. Without number one, we end up with malevolent compassion. And then number two, what he goes to is President Nelson's identity hierarchy. We've talked about this a lot as well, where if someone says, okay, well, I'm gay, or I'm trans, or I'm lesbian, or whatever it might be, or you know what, I'm black, or I am Asian, or I am white. These are all identifiers that are way down here. And what identitarianism tries to do is lift these other identities and labels above the more important labels. And so President Nelson has outlined the three main identities that we should look at. Number one, child of God. Number two, child of the covenant. And number three, disciple of Christ. Right? And all other identities and labels are below that. And you can see how the adversary works with these pernicious ideologies, because he tries to say, look, these other identities are more important. Elevate them as much as possible. That's what Pride Month is all about. That's what the pride flag is all about. I'm going to lift these other identities on a platform above the other identities of being a child of God, a child of the covenant, and a disciple of Christ, or any other more important identity. It's turning who we are on our heads. So he says here then, going to this second idea about identity, he says, as persons and family members experience such feelings as same-sex attraction, they should be careful with labels. That is not what pride is about. President Russell M. Nelson spoke of this in the Worldwide Devotional last year. Again, you got to search out for these things in these other venues. He taught that labeling is universally limiting because it divides and restricts the people, the way people think about themselves and each other. It divides us. And that is what pride is about. Consequently, he taught no identifier should displace, replace, or take priority over these three enduring designations: child of God, child of the covenant, and disciple of Christ. So I think that we've been right in the message on this podcast about those two areas and what they really mean. I mean, look where President Oaks goes to. He's pulling from a precedence of what has been talked about recently in the last few years with the two commandments and with the President Nelson's identity hierarchy. So that is what those things are. They are a response to these pernicious ideologies, these secular ideologies that are completely against faith, completely against the doctrine of Christ. But they're just not that direct. They're not that precise. So that's why we've tried to break them down and say, see, look, they have talked about it. Look at what this means. And this to me is complete confirmation for President Oaks as he's trying to answer these questions about this confusion about identitarianism. He goes right to these two areas. The question I would have is, why is there nothing more direct than this? This seems to me there are great ways to teach this, but they're almost kind of at that 30,000-foot level of a parable where nothing is really called out. And now if you go to the other devotionals and other speeches, you do get a more direct response. I'll show you a few of those here in a minute. But it is no wonder to me that this 17-year-old girl here and a large swath of the members of the church are confused. Number one, I don't think there's a lot of direct messaging on this. You've got to pull these things that are like the identity hierarchy and the two commandments and really understand what they're trying to say. And then you have Latter-day Saint influencers and social media and leaders, local leaders, that are not adding the first commandment. They're not adding truth. They're not talking about the law of chastity. They're not talking about the commandments. They're simply trying to give a teddy bear Jesus approach to all of this. And that is completely inappropriate. It's completely wrong. And it's completely against what the brethren are teaching. I don't think there's any question that we've been getting away from the idea of standing for truth, of proclaiming truth. And we're falling into the spiral of silence with the first commandment. Now, you can see some of these things that are brought up from the brethren in a number of different areas. All of what I'm going to show you here is from colleges, right? This is going to be from BYU addresses, and this is going to be from the Ensign College with President Oaks and Elder Gilbert. So this here is the infamous, shouldn't have been, but the infamous talk given by Elder Holland at BYU in 2021. This is a great talk. It is a heartfelt talk. And of course, because it did not go along with pride, therefore it was turned into a hate speech by those who advocate for pride. And it needs to be said that when he brings up muskets here, He's not talking about pointing them at others. He's talking about defending the truth. He's talking about the First Commandment, defending God. And by the way, he is quoting then Elder Oaks, who did the same thing in a BYU address and talked about the exact same thing about the doctrine of the family in regards to a trowel building the kingdom while you have a musket defending the kingdom. And he uses that idea with defending the doctrine of the family. And Elder Oaks was referring to a talk given at BYU by Elder Maxwell. So you have these three witnesses, Elder Maxwell, then Elder Oaks, Elder Holland, all giving the same example about defending the doctrine of the family. And there's a reason Elder Holland and the others have given this at BYU, because there are those at BYU who do not defend that doctrine. Listen to what he has to say.
The dual role of builder and defender is unique and ongoing. I'm grateful we have scholars today who can handle, as it were, both trowel and musket. Then Elder Oaks said challengingly, I'd like to hear a little more musket fire from the Temple of Learning.
Okay, he's saying, what is he saying? He's not talking about shooting people like assassins. He's talking about defending the doctrine of the family.
He said this in a way that could have applied to a host of topics in various departments, but the one he specifically mentioned was the doctrine of the family and defending marriage as the union of a man and a woman.
Okay, so this is going completely contrary to what these influencers are talking about. Right? And so therefore, because you can see this, because it's going against what they're talking about and their interpretation of the proclamation of the family and their hope in change, they turn this into, a hate speech from Elder Holland. Okay, you can see the different ways of looking at this, the way the brethren look at it and how many members and influencers look at it. They're very different. One is based in faith and the doctrine of Christ, and one is based in secular and, quite frankly, Marxian tenets. Now, next, I've got a couple clips here from President Oaks and Elder Gilbert from an address given at Ensign College. This is a fabulous talk by the two of them. And both President Oaks and Elder Gilbert do a great job, and they address the exact issues that we have talked about on this podcast for a long time and that are necessary to not have this confusion. Listen to what they have to say.
Second is the pervasive sense of intellectual supremacy that exists in society and especially in colleges and universities.
Okay, well, that's not a surprise, and that is where these ideologies come from, right?
President Spencer W. Kimball responded to this when he stated that we must become a bastion of righteousness, resisting the, quote, invading ideologies that seek control of curriculum as well as classroom.
Wow. Yeah, wow, that was me commenting on that. That's exactly right. And look what's happening to the curriculum in the classroom, especially K-12. And it's already happening in colleges nationwide and universities and even at BYU and some of the CES schools. Right? So they're addressing this directly.
We do not resist such ideas because we fear them, he said, but because they are false.
Now, he's going to go back to a lot of the DNA that I've talked about here, or at least in general terms, talking about tyranny versus what would come about through an idea of liberty. These ideas are based through a DNA that would push tyranny over liberty. And you're going to hear this again from Elder Christofferson in a minute. These pernicious ideologies, these secular ideologies, are not about liberty or the doctrine of Christ.
Tendency of those who call good evil to bully or shout down or put negative labels on those who disagree.
Exactly what we see.
They seek to intimidate them by shaming or silencing opposition to their untruths.
Okay, the spiral of silence. That's what's happened. Now, I will say, where we do see this in these addresses at these colleges, the universities, I will say that there's not a lot of this directness that we find in General Conference. Now, I'm not saying there should be. I don't know the answer to that. I trust what the brethren are doing. But boots on the ground here, we need to understand why there is confusion, and we need to seek out these words from the brethren. Now, lastly, from this video, Elder Gilbert here is going to talk about, again, why these things are pulled together. I would do this because we're going to get something very parallel to this by Elder Christofferson in a clip from an address that he gave very recently at BYU. So Elder Gilbert's going to talk about the Constitution. He's going to talk about liberty here and these bad, pernicious ideologies.
Despite the humor of that video, you are going to have to learn to turn and face the right way in the elevator, even when everyone else is telling you to turn
This is
around
from a
and face
video
the back.
he had shown.
In your heart, you'll know this can't be the right thing they're doing, but you have to have the courage to stand fast, looking in the right direction.
So get rid of the spiral of silence.
Now, President Oaks, in the last 3 general conferences, you have spoken about issues related to the family, religion, and the Constitution.
Okay. The family, the religion, and the Constitution. Well, what does the Constitution have to do with those things? It's liberty. These ideologies, if you understand them, are completely anti-constitutional. They hate the Constitution. They try to bring the Constitution down constantly. That, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, the pride flag partially represents that. It partially represents being against the Constitution. That's what the DNA of pride and those colors come from. It is intersectionality.
What is it about these institutions that are so important to the church?
This is key.
Thank you. The family is a core institution of civil society. As we read in the Family Proclamation, it is, quote, central to the Creator's plan for the eternal destiny of His children, unquote. Of course, the adversary will attack such a central part of the plan and try to persuade the children of God to depart from it.
Okay, I'm sorry. That is what the influencers are trying to do. This is when you put it right up next to each other, it's not that hard to see.
Religion. Religion stands as a firewall against the adversary's onslaughts on many other key institutions or ideas in the world.
Family, religion.
We know from experience that the teachings and practices of religion strengthen society generally. As for the Constitution, the Constitutional Bill of Rights guarantees protect the good that religious believers and their churches, synagogues, and mosques can do.
Okay. Now, so this is important to see. Again, these ideologies are anti-family. That's why they're bringing this up. They're anti-family, they are anti-religious, they're anti-faith, and they are anti-liberty and Constitution. That's what President Oaks is saying here. That's what the brethren are saying, because it's not just President Oaks that is going over this. Pride Month is fighting against all of those things. I promise you, ultimately it is. Secondly, it is elevating lower labels to the highest position possible over President Nelson's identity hierarchy. Now, lastly, I want to go to Elder Christofferson at the recent graduation commencement at Brigham Young University. I happen to have been there. I listened to the talks given before Elder Christofferson spoke. Not all of them, but a number of them. I did like the fact that I could tell that these had gone through a certain filtering process in their speeches, because I never heard the full phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion in any of these talks. And yet I heard a lot of the word diversity, a lot of the word inclusion, and a lot of the word equity. Right? So these things were brought up oftentimes, but never brought together as diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you can see what the style guide, if you will, was allowing and not allowing these students and others to be able to say in their speeches. And it was so refreshing at the end when Elder Christofferson got up and gave his talk trying to set some things straight. It was wonderful. And he talks about the liberty and the Constitution along with the family, along with the idea of secularism versus religion. Listen to what he has to say.
The year I was born was the year World War II ended. I know, I'm old. But that was a victory for freedom and moral agency. Unfortunately, the intervening 78 years have brought many, often devastating efforts at despotic enslavement, and they seem to be increasing in number.
Okay, so again, here he's talking about, he's bringing in the idea of the Constitution, the founding of America, and liberty. And he's going to connect it with family, and he's going to connect it with these ideas, these secular ideas.
Of particular concern are trends and philosophies that deny the reality of individual and moral agency, and societal conditions that disable the effective exercise of individual agency. You're familiar with voices that would classify entire races as hapless victims on the one hand, or irredeemable oppressors on the other.
Okay, now he's talking about critical race theory, right? That's exactly what that idea is, what that system is, what that philosophy is. It's one of these pernicious ideologies found in the religion of academia. And what is so great about this is it helps me understand that he understands these things, because he's using the term victim and oppressor. He's using critical theory. And that's what this is. And he's saying, look, what critical theory does is it takes the gospel, it takes principles, it takes everything, and it divides and conquers. And it removes your moral agency in the sense that it removes individualism. You've heard the idea of expressive individualism. Really all that is bringing you into a collective. And he's saying how this is a pernicious ideology. Critical race theory, he doesn't call it out by name, but that's obviously exactly what he's talking about, is a pernicious ideology. And it's a concern because it disrupts the liberty and the moral agency of individuals. The other thing about critical theory is it because you likely would prefer to be the victim than the oppressor when you have those two choices, it always says that the problem is out there. It's not my agency that matters. It's not my repentance. It's not my behavior. The problem is out there with the oppressors. It's very anti-Christ because it takes away my sense of progression. It takes away my sense of repentance and humility. If I don't have the problem, then what do I need to change? After all, I'm living my own truth, and the problem is out there.
At the same time, we cannot deny that many grow up in chaotic homes, broken communities, non-functional schools, and circumstances that make it all but impossible to get hold of the tools needed to exercise moral agency wisely.
Okay. Again, here, and I've hit this ad nauseum, without charity, liberty is impossible. It's impossible. And the idea of a free capitalist democracy, liberal democracy, it cannot exist, and the Founding Fathers have said this, it cannot exist without a righteous people. It cannot exist without charity because it does open up opportunity because of liberty. And therefore there becomes greater and greater disparities. And that's the opposite of equity, right? Equity wants to come in and take all of the disparities that come from freedom and liberty and agency and wants to force them into the same result. That's equity. That is the plan of the adversary. However, those opportunities and that liberty that is available without social charity, so to speak, without us helping each other out, pulling up our neighbor and being pulled up by our neighbor. Without charity, we leave this massive void where these pernicious ideologies then can come in saying, see, look at the disparities. We see this over and over again in the pride cycle in the Book of Mormon.
Work hard to preserve and wisely exercise your own moral agency, and work equally hard to preserve and provide that same blessing of moral agency to others.
That's the key. You got to do both. That, to me, again, is what we talked about in a recent episode on the 3 parables, right? The 10 virgins, the talents, and the sheep and goats. It's exactly what this is.
May I also recommend that you promote in every appropriate way President Dallin H. Oaks' teachings in his address defending our divinely inspired Constitution as they relate to upholding moral agency.
Okay. So there you go again. I mean, a parallel to what was spoken of by Elder Gilbert and President Oaks, bringing up the Constitution because you're looking at liberty. And so you have these pernicious ideologies like identitarianism that is held up in pride, right? And here the brethren are talking about these things in a way of kind of a triangle here of family, the doctrine of the family, of religion, and faith over secularism, and then liberty. These are all things that fight off these ideologies, and that's what these ideologies are all attacking.
Most importantly, however, it will be what you do at home that will matter most. The family, after all, is ordained of God. Marriage between man and woman is essential to his eternal plan.
Boom.
Children are entitled to birth within the bonds of matrimony and to be reared by a father and a mother who honor marital vows with complete fidelity. We call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society.
So I hope that we can see during this month and what this identitarianism and these pernicious ideologies are upholding, that we can see directly there are certain influencers and certain members of the church, and certainly many outside of the church in our cultural shift, that are pushing these ideas that attack the traditional family, that attack liberty, and that attack faith and religion, right? These are all from a fountain of secularism found from the religion of academia that fight against these things. And when we hold these things side to side, we can see the disparity between the two of them. We should be advocating for faith over secularism, for the traditional family, and marriage being ordained of a man and a woman, for liberty and the ability to choose and to exercise our moral agency. And if we can find these words from the brethren and bring them together, we see these patterns that they are talking about with the first and second commandment, identity, and which identities need to be held up. And we can also see that in this month, these other identities are being put up on a platform over and above, elevated above our true identities, primarily as children of God. Thanks for listening.